Where is everybody? I know. Everybody just left. Well, if you want to go ahead and open your Bibles to Genesis 37, we're going to start there and work our way through several passages of Scripture. We've been talking about leadership, and we're working through some biblical characters, some Bible characters, in our discussion of what leadership looks like, using some of the principles we learned from our first study. And this week, we're going to be continuing Joseph. If you remember, we talked about Joseph in his pre-Egypt condition, if you will, where he experienced some difficulties with his brothers, and we looked at several characters. There are several people at play here. We looked at how the father treated Joseph. Do y'all remember how the father treated Joseph? What was it that was different about Joseph? Why was he treated differently? Or should I say, how did he treat him differently? Anybody remember? Absolutely. Yeah, bore him in his old age. The favorite wife, yes. Favorite wife, favorite child. And so what did he do for him or to him that ended up being a representation of that favor? A coat, yes, a coat or a tunic or whatever your version says, right? And so we talked about that a little bit, and I think this is actually a very significant theme in this narrative, and it involves this tunic. And the tunic represents the father's favor. And we've had this discussion before, but sometimes we forget, and we have to be reminded of these things. But in Hebrew, the word is kavod. I don't know if you remember that word or not. Doxa in Greek and kavod in Hebrew, and it means glory. It means glory. It's the word that's translated glory, or splendor. It's also translated splendor. And there's a couple of ways we can look at that. Either a person's glory is something like them being a king, or maybe we've talked about this before, but if a person has a lot of goats, if they're in a farming community like these people are, ranching type community kind of agriculture, and they have the most goats, then they're different than everybody else. They have more goats than everybody, and those goats would become their glory, if you can imagine goats being anybody's glory. That's how that works. And so it's just whatever elevates the person above everybody else. And then there is the symbol of that elevation. So a king has a status, that's his glory, and the symbol of that status would be what? What would be a symbol of a king's status? Crown, robes, signet ring, all these different things. Yeah, there's several things that set the king apart, and those are also called the king's glory, right? That's how that language would work. Now, it's not really his glory, it's a representation of it, but still, nonetheless, it is his glory. And so what we're seeing here is that Joseph, at the very beginning of the story, receives something from his father that is a representation of his elevated status in the family, and suddenly this coat becomes his glory and a representation of his elevated status. That may not mean much to you right now, but it will by the time we get to the end of this lesson, because it is extremely significant in the storyline. Okay, so where we left Joseph before, we left him in a pit, right? His brothers became jealous of his elevated status in the family, and he kind of said some things about some dreams that he was going to rule over them, and they didn't like that either. And so they throw him into a pit, and who rescues him from death? Do y'all remember which brother? Reuben, right? And so we talked about Reuben as being in what order in the family? The first, okay? And so in that culture, the firstborn always has a double portion in the inheritance. They always have more than the rest. There's a sense in which there is an obligation and a responsibility given to the firstborn in that culture. And so he's actually stepping up to that role and taking his authoritative position in the family and rescuing his brother from death. So he falls in the pit, or goes into the pit. They take the coat, which is a representation of the father's glory, and what do they do with it? Right, yeah, they slaughter a goat and they smear blood all over it, and so they're covering up this symbol of the father's favor, and they take it to the father and present it and say, "Look at this. Is this yours?" Of course, they know it's the son's, but they're trying to get the father to believe that Joseph is dead. And so I've mentioned this several times before, but I think it's worth mentioning again. The parallels between Joseph's story and Jesus' story. There are so many of them, and it's incredible if you sit and take the time to really look at them, or if you're looking for them, because there's a couple of things here. First off, we have the glory of somebody being basically tainted, right, with blood. So it's taking off of a coat, it's the removing of a coat, it's the removing of something that is symbolic, and covering it with blood. Slaughtering of an animal in a substitutionary way. Obviously, we can see a lot of symbolism there and a lot of ways in which we can kind of walk with that and see that in several passages of Scripture. Also, the very fact that he's thrown into a pit. He's in the earth, and then what happens to him? He doesn't die, per se, but he's as good as dead, and then what happens? He comes out. He's brought out of the pit. And so that doesn't happen once, but actually happens twice to him in this story, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But there's so many ways in which these are symbolic. Once he comes out of the pit, he is going to, and this is our main theme for this portion of this study, is he's going to be elevated, and he's going to use his elevated status to rescue his brothers. That sounds very familiar, doesn't it? I mean, that's exactly how we see Jesus. Jesus, he was stripped of his own garments. He was beaten. He was bloodied. And it's his blood, of course, and not a goat's blood. He is thrown into a pit, right? I mean, that's kind of what a tomb is in a sense. But then he comes back out as the resurrected Lord, and then he is raised up, if you will. He ascends to the Father's right hand in glory. And his position of glory, he uses it not for his own self-needs, I don't know how you would phrase that well, but not for himself, but he uses his position of glory to rescue his brothers and sisters. And so we see that symbolism there. We see Joseph acting that role in this story as well. Anyway, if you look at it, there are so many of them that you can just sit there and spend a lot of time navigating through that. We're going to start, that was actually verse 37. Let me go ahead and end that section, and then we'll move on to another chapter. It said in the latter part of that chapter that they pulled him up, they lifted Joseph out of the pit, and sold him to an Ishmaelite, or the Ishmaelites, for 20 shekels of silver. Then again, we've got a lot of things that we can look at that were very similar with Jesus, the selling of him for a certain amount of money, and they brought Joseph into Egypt. Ishmaelites, who was Ishmael? Anybody remember? Son of Hagar, right? So that came from our other story. So remember, God promised Abraham and Sarah that they would have a child, and there was the child of promise, and then they get old and they get impatient, and then they decide, let's use Hagar and let's have a child, and we will call it our child, and that will be God's fulfillment of God's promise. And they did. And then there's anger and jealousy and strife in the family, and she gets run off, and whatnot. To me, these little bits of the story are interesting because we've come full circle. We have Isaac, the child who was actually born of God's promise, and now it's his children, right? It's his family that we're talking about here. And this one child is being sold to Ishmael's family, in essence. And so it's very interesting how these little stories kind of collide together as we see things unfold. So verse 37, it ends with the brothers slaughtering the male goat. We already talked about that. And presenting it to the father. The father perceives that the son is dead, but in a very symbolic way, he's kind of resurrected from the dead, in a sense, because he's actually alive, but he's perceived to be dead. And so Joseph will be put in a position of authority. And we'll skip through several passages of Scripture. There's a lot to read, and we're not going to read it all. But we're going to see how Joseph exemplifies leadership in this position that he is put in. So go ahead and skip to chapter 39. Skip to chapter 39, and we'll start reading there. Genesis 39. Let me just go ahead and get there as well. All right, starting at verse 1. It says, "Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an Egyptian officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the bodyguard, bought him from the Ishmaelites, who had taken him down there." Okay, so Potiphar, he's way up in the command ranks. We don't know exactly. This wording is a little different depending on what translation you have. Captain of the bodyguards. It's possible that he is captain over Pharaoh's personal guards. That he's got some guards that are always with him and around him, and that was his position. But the language also suggests, or could be translated, captain of the slaughterers. And so we don't know exactly what that means. Some people have kind of looked and thought about that and looked at other examples, and they thought, well, maybe he was captain of the executioners, and that word has been used for that as well. We don't know. It doesn't really matter. It's something kind of to think about. Most likely this translation is right, that he's captain of the bodyguards. These would have been Pharaoh's personal guards. But it's also possible that he was in charge of those who would execute anyone who would oppose the king, and that's very possible as well. But whatever he is or whoever he is a high-ranking official in Pharaoh's house. And he buys Joseph. And then verse 2, it says, "The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master, the Egyptian. Now his master saw that the Lord was with him, and how the Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and became his personal servant. And he made him overseer over his house and all that he owned, and he put him in charge. It came about that from the time he made him overseer in his house and over all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. Thus the Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned, in the house and in the field. So he left everything he owned in Joseph's charge, and with him there he did not concern himself with anything except food which he ate." Okay, so the last time we saw Joseph finding favor in somebody's eyes, did it end well? Was it a good ending? It wasn't. It was his father, right? His father found favor, and it ended up causing jealousy and strife, and it just didn't end well. So now we have Joseph having gone through that experience, right, of his brothers throwing him into a pit, which is pretty traumatic. He knows what that's like. He knows what happens to people who are elevated in their status. And now it's happening again. But now he's doing it he's going to have more wisdom. The Lord is with him. He's in a foreign land. It's recognized by Potiphar that he is being successful, and the Lord is with him and blessed him. And so now he's going to elevate Joseph up in his house and make him overseer over all that he has, so that he doesn't have to worry about anything. Just the food that he eats, that's all he's concerned about, because Joseph's going to take care of everything else in the household, right? So I want you to think about a couple of things. Joseph's prosperity, right, his exalted position, is not for his own personal gain, okay? It is not for his own personal gain. That is not why God is exalting him. That is not why he is being successful. I know sometimes we hear people talk about, well, God wants you to be prosperous and successful, and he's going to elevate you. And a lot of times that language is used for you. It's like, that should encourage you. That should be for you, that he's going to do that for you. But all the people that we see who are elevated in the Bible, they're elevated for a purpose. God has a purpose for them, and it's not for them. In fact, a lot of times when people are exalted, they don't always receive fair treatment. They are not always looked at well. And in this case, he is, but in a lot of cases, that's not the situation. They find themselves in a very authoritative position, and that's dangerous. That's dangerous. We like to think about leadership as always a good thing, but it's not always a good thing, right? I mean, you put somebody in a position of authority. For one, what are some risks? Let me just ask you that. Just thinking about that idea, being put in a position of authority, what are some risks when a person is elevated to a position of authority? What are some risks? Okay, there you go. That sense, that responsibility, that it's up to you and you get blamed if something goes wrong. What else? Greed? We've seen that, absolutely. Yep, absolutely. Anybody else? Mistreatment? Yeah, we see that. I mean, we just think about leaders as people, we almost envy them. We look at them and we think, oh, wow, he's a king. That must be awesome. But that's not always awesome, right? I mean, there are limitations, there are responsibilities, but there's also a tremendous amount of risk, right? I mean, how often do we get to see the president just walk out of the White House and go get some ice cream or something? On purpose, all right. How often do we get to see that? It just doesn't work, right? I mean, you cannot have that kind of freedom. Why? Why can people of high positions not have the freedom to just go where they want to go or do what they want to do? Yeah, the risk factor. They're in danger. Their life is in danger. Because when you get to a certain point in your status, people want to remove you from that place. They want to tear you down and destroy you. So God is not going to elevate Joseph for his own prosperity. He's not going to exalt him to a position for his own personal gain, but it's going to be for others, okay? It's going to be for others. So there's something more to consider. When God puts a person in leadership, it's not for the person's own glory. It's not for the person's own gain, but it is for the glory and the benefit of who? Of God, ultimately, right? It's for the glory and benefit of God, but it's also for the benefit of someone else. That's why God puts people in authority. It's for somebody else's benefit. As people in the world see leadership as a goal to obtain for themselves, biblical leaders see their position of authority as a benefit to others. If you think about that, it may take a little while to think about that, or maybe it won't take you a little while to think about that, but you think about why somebody wants a place of leadership. Why do people want positions of authority? Why do people want positions of power? Is it because they feel like they can do good things for somebody else? Could be. I mean, every so often we run into the elections, and what do we get to hear about potential leaders? They have wonderful things for us. We hear that a lot. And it's sure, I'm not going to say they don't have, our best interest in mind sometimes, but we kind of, laugh at that because we think, yeah, right, you really have my best interest in mind. I mean, that's really why you want to be president. We think that way. But there's a good reason why we think that way, right? Because people have a tendency to abuse positions of power. People have a tendency to abuse positions of leadership. But when you're looking at true biblical leaders, is that something that a lot of people just aspire to day in and day out and look forward to and they fight for and they try to win people to their side and glorify themselves and build themselves up? Is that how we see a lot of these biblical leaders going up the ladder? It's usually not. It's usually God taking somebody like Joseph and doing something extraordinary with him and elevating him to a power of authority. Think about Jesus for a little bit. When we think about Jesus, I saw a picture just the other day of him, photo of him, of course. I'm sure it was accurate. And of course he's, light complected and long hair, and he's just beautiful looking man, and you're thinking, yeah, right, is that really what Jesus looked like? But then think about who he was in society and how people perceived him. When they encountered Jesus, they didn't think of him as, exemplary in his looks. He wasn't a guy who had, chariots and horses pulling him everywhere. He wasn't somebody wearing robes of royalty or a crown of royalty. The guy didn't even have a house, Jesus was a humble servant and not somebody that you would look at from a distance and think, whoa, look at that guy. He must be a king. No, that's not how he was. But God took the form of somebody like that, a humble Nazarite who didn't even have anything. He had his clothes and his friends and his disciples, and that is how he chose to present himself and elevate himself in the form of a king. And that's what we see in Jesus as leaders. Now, is it true that when we're talking about in the church, right, leadership in the church, what are one of the qualifications for an elder? What is that involves them desiring the eldership? Well, showing by example, okay. But they have to at least aspire to the position. They have to at least desire to have that place. So we see that with the church leadership, that they have to at least want to, right? There's a desire to it. But there's also a sense of humility, right? There's a sense of humbleness. I have never sat across from a man who was considering the eldership who said, you know what? I fit all the criteria, and I am ready to serve. I've never done that before. And I've sat in front of several people who are considering the eldership. 99.9% of the time, they say, I don't fit. There's so many things here that I just don't live up to. There's so many things here that I miss. And it's not because they're bad people, but it's because they're very honest people and very humble people. And we all look at that list and we think, wow, it's incredible, But a person who aspires to that is somebody who desires to do it not for themselves, not for sordid gain. Remember, that was the other part of it, but for the benefit of the congregation. And so that's one way we can look at this example of Joseph. He's going to be elevated not for himself, but for the benefit of the people. Yeah. Yeah. Moses is an interesting story because what we know about Moses, he was actually trained in Pharaoh's house to be a spokesman. His ability to speak must have been above and beyond everybody's. But his biggest fear was the fact that he already has been rejected by his people. And God is basically asking him to go back to the Hebrews who have already rejected you and speak to them again. That was his big fear. And he pretty much said, I can't do that. It's pretty amazing. So Genesis 39, we're going to look at this passage real quick. Joseph, he was handsome in form and appearance. So, if you have the New Living Translation, it probably says something like he was a good-looking fella, something like that. I don't actually know what it says. I didn't read it, but that's the idea. And it came about after these events that his master's wife looked with desire at Joseph and said, lie with me. But he refused, and he said to his master's wife, behold, with me here, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house, and he has put all that he owns in my charge. In other words, he's saying, I have been put in charge. I have been given authority. I have a responsibility. And there is no one greater in this house than I. Now, he's not trying to brag. He's just making a point. It's true. Potiphar put him in that place. And he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. And how then could I do this great evil and sin against who? Against God, right? Not Potiphar, but against God. Although it certainly is a transgression against his neighbor, but he's thinking of how this looks to God. As she spoke to Joseph day after day, so this wasn't a one-time advance. This was day after day Joseph had to endure as he's trying to do his job. She is just constantly after him. And he did not listen to her, to lie beside her or be with her. And now it happened one day that he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the household was there inside. Do you think that was by design? Yeah, I kind of think that is too. And then she caught him by his garment and said, "Lay with me." And he left his garment in her hand and fled and went outside. Of course, we often hear that as, fleeing from sin and things like that. But I want to think about the perspective here. There's a couple of things we may not realize. If indeed Potiphar is one of Pharaoh's guardsmen, most likely he would have been a eunuch. Okay? That's how the people who oversaw the house of royalty were most likely, most of the time, eunuchs. Which means that this relationship that he had with his wife, it was just all for show. There was just a household that was established. And so most likely, a lot of Bible scholars and historians read through this, and they assume that this idea of Potiphar's wife having one of the servants was probably not an unusual circumstance. The difference in this situation was the position Joseph was in. First off, he's obviously already been told that lady's off limits, right? I mean, it seems evident to me that was a message that was very clear to Joseph. And the fact that he has been put in a position of authority, and he has a job, he has a responsibility, and he is handling it quite well, right? I mean, he's exercising that authority. He is recognizing his position. He's not gloating. He's not looking at that as a position for himself. He's not saying, well, look at me, I'm second in charge of Potiphar's house. No, he is looking at it as a way to do two things. One, to honor his master in that position of authority, to benefit the master. And secondly, to honor who? To honor God, right? And that's what we look for leadership. And so he's certainly doing that. He's taking that position of authority. He is honoring his master. He's honoring God. He is not looking for glory for himself, but he's doing what is right. And as a leader, Joseph shows his moral integrity by resisting this temptation, not just once, but day in and day out, constantly resisting this temptation. Okay? Look at verse 21. It said, "But when the Lord was with Joseph," we're skipping on, we kind of know what happens here. Joseph ends up in another pit, right? A prison this time, once Potiphar finds out what happened. And verse 21, it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him and gave him favor in the sight of the chief jailer. And the chief jailer committed to Joseph's charge all the prisoners who were in jail, so that whatever was done there, he was responsible for it. And the chief jailer do not supervise anything under Joseph's charge, because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it to prosper." That's very interesting, right? I mean, here we have another scenario where he is put in a difficult situation, and the chief jailer recognizes in him a character, a morality. I would imagine that Joseph wasn't looking for a position of authority, but he was given a position of authority. He was raised up by the chief jailer, so the chief jailer didn't even have to worry about the prisoners, because Joseph was taking care of that, right? He was exercising his authority with honor and humility and servanthood, and he was benefiting others with the position in which he was put. And he submits to God in all that he does. Okay? Any thoughts or questions on that before we jump jump again? Mm-hmm. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It's really a great example of biblical leadership. All right, jumping to verse 39. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, we're jumping ahead even more because there's some dreams that go on with, in that situation, the cupbearer and the baker. And the Pharaoh hears about this. So Pharaoh has his own dream, okay? It's very disturbing to him. And so Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has informed you of all of this, there is no one so discerning and wise as you are. You remember the story was that Pharaoh had a dream. He didn't know how to interpret it. And so he calls upon this man who somebody said, hey, I remember this guy. I was in jail with him. And he can interpret dreams. And you should call him. So here's Joseph before Pharaoh. And he is able to, with God's ability, God's power, interpret this dream. In fact, look what it says in verse 40. You shall be over my house, and according to your command, all my people shall do homage. Only in the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And then Pharaoh took off his signet ring. Remember, we talked about some of the emblems of glory, right? And this is certainly one of those that was listed. Took off the Pharaoh's signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand. And then he clothed them in a garment of fine linen and put the gold necklace around his neck. And then it says that he had him ride in his second chariot, and they proclaimed before him, bow the knee. And he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, though I am Pharaoh, yet without your permission, no one shall raise his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. That's pretty incredible. I mean, here he goes from this young boy, that at least we assume he's a young boy at the beginning of the story, who his father shows favor to. His brothers are jealous and throw him to a pit, and take off his coat. And all of a sudden, now he is second in command of the greatest nation in the world, in the known world. He has been given extraordinary power and extraordinary position of authority. Now, I just want you to kind of think about that for a minute. What would most people do if they suddenly found themselves second in command of the greatest nation in the world? What would most people do with that position? Abuse it, right? Now, what if you were a person whose brothers threw you in a pit? What do you think? What would be your first thought? Yeah, right? As king to the king, I think I have an idea of what I'm going to do with my power. But then again, Pharaoh is exalting Joseph, and he is going to take that position not as if it was from Pharaoh, but as if it was from God, which he believes that's where it's coming from. And he's not going to execute any kind of judgment. He's not going to abuse that position. He's not looking for his own personal gain, his own personal glory, but he's going to use that position to bless even the foreign nation of Egypt. He's going to use that position to bless Egypt, but he's also going to use that position to rescue his family from the coming famine that will practically wipe out this entire land. If it had not been for Joseph in the exalted position, who knows how many would have perished during this famine, as extraordinary as it was. And so he's going to have them prepare, and he's going to be the one leading them in that preparation. All right, jump ahead to 42. Okay? So this is chapter 42. Chapter 42, verses 5 and 6. I'm sorry. I know I'm jumping a lot. There's a lot of passages here. It would take us a while to read through it. But I'm really just focusing on the ones that I feel best give the example of leadership. So the sons of Israel come to buy grain. Remember this famine, he's collected the grain during a period of abundance, and he has stored the grain. And if you want to read about that, there's some history about them finding these vessels with grain still in them. It's pretty interesting. So the sons of Israel came to buy grain among those who were coming, for the famine was in the land of Canaan also. And now Joseph was the ruler over the land. So the dream has become a reality. The vision has become a reality. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land, and Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Now, at the moment, they don't know who he is, right? And so they're bowing down to a man that is in charge. He has authority, and they don't understand at the moment that this is their brother. All they know is this man is a ruler in Egypt. They don't know how he got there. They don't know how he became a ruler. They don't know who he is, but they're going to pay homage. They're going to bow down before him. And it's really interesting. Remember what we talked about the two main points of biblical leadership. What's the first one? Authority. And what's the second? Submission, right? And it doesn't matter where you are on that scale, whether you're the person who has been put in authority or whether you're the person who is in submission, that you exercise leadership. You exercise godly leadership by holding up that position, right? In a lot of cases, we find ourselves in positions of submission more than we do positions of authority. But each place has its own place. And these men are being put in a position where they have to exercise submission in order to survive, in order to live. And it just so happens to be their brother Joseph that they are submitting to. Then again, we can talk about how he could have taken revenge, he could have been prideful, he could have done all sorts of things. But he doesn't do that, right? He does test them. There's a series of tests. I guess he's trying to get an idea of who they are and what they have become over the years. But he doesn't seek revenge. He doesn't try to hurt them. He doesn't try to damage them in any way. But he's going to kind of act as their savior, as their redeemer, as he's going to be instrumental in rescuing them from the famine. All right, chapter 45, verse 13 is a very important passage to the narrative because it really brings this theme of glory together. And I want you to read it with me and look at this passage. This is chapter 45, verse 13. And it says, "Now you must tell your father," he's talking to his brothers. They've already, he's revealed himself to them, and they've, had a little bit of a reunion going on there. I'll let you read that for yourselves. But he tell my father of all my splendor. Now, in the Hebrew language, that word is kavod, it's glory. Go tell my father of all of my glory in Egypt and all that you have seen, and you must hurry and bring my father down here. Now, the reason that's so significant is because of how the story started. Okay? This is towards the end of the story, obviously. But the point is that the very beginning of the story, we have a young man who has been exalted by his father and given a symbol of his status. His brothers ripped that from him and threw him in a pit. And then God turns around and raises him up and brings him to a position of power and authority for the benefit of the brothers who put him to death, or tried to anyway. The idea is they did. Their heart was bent towards that. And now he wants his brothers to go back home and say, hey, Dad, guess what God has done for me? He has brought me up. Look, I want you to come and see all of my glory. I want you to come and see all that the Father of heaven has done for me. And it's an incredibly significant and powerful part of that story and that message. Chapter 50. And with this section, we're just going to read a few verses and then we'll just wrap this up. Chapter 50, starting in verse 18. It says, "And then also his brothers came and they fell down before him and said, 'Behold, we are your servants.'" I mean, what an incredible change. But I mean, they're taking their place. This is their place of submission. But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place?" All right, so what is he thinking here? Yes, he is one of the most powerful people in the world, okay? At this time, Egypt was the biggest nation, the most powerful, if not the second, probably the first. From what I understand, Babylon really wasn't established quite yet. It was still working its way up to power. And so he is one of the most powerful people in the world. But ultimately, who does he give credit to? Yes. He said, it's God's place, right? I mean, what are you guys doing? I mean, how dare you vow to me? It is God's place. Am I in a place of God? And he says, "As for you, you meant evil against me." But what did God mean? Good. In order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. For therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones. So he comforted them and he spoke kindly to them. Right? I mean, then again, he points to God. He gives God the credit. Right? He gives God the credit. He is humble. He is in a powerful position of authority. But he doesn't use that position for his own personal gain. But he uses that position to benefit not only the people of Egypt, but the very people who tried to murder him, right? His own brothers. And he uses it to benefit them and their family, and he rightfully takes that place of leadership. And they are rightfully taking the place of submission and falling in line with the one God has placed in power. So I'm going to restate something I said earlier, but I want you to think about this and let that be the main point of this lesson. God puts people in positions of authority or leadership to benefit others and not for personal gain. God puts people in positions of authority or leadership to benefit others and not for personal gain. Okay? Any thoughts or questions? All right. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer, and then that will finish our studies of Joseph, and then we'll pick up on a new study next Wednesday. Let's pray together. Father, we are so incredibly thankful for all the stories that you have for us in your scriptures that we can go and read about people who have lived out their faith. Father, people who have had struggles and difficulties of their own, who have faced trials and tribulations, but people who have maintained their position and their purpose and a desire to do your will. Father, we see how you have worked through people, Father, to bring about your perfect result. We just pray that we can be humble, that we can recognize within ourselves the need for servanthood, the need for humility, that you may work through us, Father, to bring about your perfect result. Thank you for all that you have blessed us with. Thank you for your Son, and it's in his name we pray. Amen.